So we're into a new section in our microeconomics course. Remember, we talked about Keynesianism and fiscal policy. We talked about monetarism and monetary policy and the Austrian school and then the non-interventionist policy. And we're working through the end of the Keynesian macroeconomic view and talking about policy. We'll do some in-class projects on fiscal policy, but we're kind of done with the lecture portion of Keynesianism and fiscal policy, and now we're moving into monetary policy and monetarism. Now, the name associated with that is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was a Nobel laureate. He taught quite a few years at University of Chicago, so the monetarist school is sometimes called the Chicago School. It's sometimes nicknamed the Chicago School. And Milton Friedman had some objections to the Keynesian view. Yet he did say that desperate, or in the equivalent he said, paraphrasing, that desperate times require desperate resources and desperate means, and so he was not opposed to radical policy during the Great Depression, and even later in his life he wasn't opposed to that, but he emphasized that the mindset, the Keynesian mindset, had created some side effect problems, and it had created some ongoing philosophical issues that turned into adverse policies that affected our nation as a whole in a dramatic way. And this idea of continuous spending outside the emergency situation is something he took exception to. So he said that, number one, when we're looking at using the Keynesian formula to get us out of a great recession, what we said we would do is we would increase government spending so that there would be more demand in the economy, and we'd reduce taxes so that people would tend to spend more and keep the economy, get the economy moving again. Two major objections to that. The first objection is that the spending, to have the spending happen, it has to go through the government, it has to go through Congress. All spending bills begin with the Congress. And politicians aren't usually very good economists. And so if they are cajoled or influenced to spend our way out of a depression, and the phrase was, we can spend ourselves rich, and does that work for you individually? Have you been able to spend yourself rich? But you're in the microeconomy, see? Things work differently in the macroeconomy than the macroeconomy. So, at least as a slogan, yes, we can spend ourselves rich because a rising tide lifts all boats, as John Fitzgerald Kennedy was fond of saying. And so if we could get this pump primed with some government spending, well, the government can back off, and the government and the rest of the economy can take over once they're optimistic again and they're not so pessimistic. But it has to go through Congress, and when it goes through Congress, Congress is not going to vote on a bill to increase spending that's $1 million or $2 million or $10 million. I mean, it's got to be a lot of money. It's got to be a huge project for Congress to spend their time and involvement to get involved in a particular project to stimulate the economy. So my illustration there would be, did you ever, when you're really thirsty, could you imagine what it would be like to get a drink of water from a fire hose? Not a good idea. Kind of take the side of your face off. No, it's not pretty. So too much, too fast. So we cannot, once it comes through, it just comes through in a huge amount. And it comes into the economy as this great big hunk of demand. Let's just talk about one that's fairly recent, and that would be, in order to get the economy moving, the Obama administration pushed a infrastructure bill where we would fix bridges and we would fix roads and we would do all this infrastructure stuff and construction type stuff to get the economy going again. It was in his first term. And when that big lump of spending comes through, does it start economic activity? We need equipment, and they're going to use up a lot of fuel, and they're going to put big machines in there, and it's going to be a big deal. And does that absorb and create a lot of employment? Yes, it does. But it comes through in a great big lump, and once the spending's over, we go from a great big boom to a great big construction slump, because the spending just kind of dried up once the government stopped keeping that construction project going. So one is that it comes through in a big gob, and that distorts the economy, and resources that would have gone into other things are now all absorbed in the construction industry. And you can't find any workers over here because they're all going into construction, because that's where the money is, because we're building all these roads and building all these infrastructure things, and that's what we need it for. The next objection that Milton Friedman had was one of timing. One of timing. That it takes time for somebody to figure out, oh, now, what would be a good thing to spend our money on? And so we don't want to spend our money just on any old thing. We want to spend it on something. Do you remember the illustrations I gave that Keynes kind of a little sarcastically said that how we could get the economy going again? We could dig a big ditch and fill it full of $100 bills inside of glass jars and put a cork on it, and that would solve the unemployment problem, because everybody's busy going after that. Or we could put them in a jar and let them up on the sea. But that's kind of dumb. It would be a whole lot better if we got the economy, why not build schools? We need more schools. And why not build power generation plants, dam up some river someplace so we can get some power. Do something useful rather than just to get the economy going. That's good in itself. But if politicians are really thinking, there's lots of things that need to be done. We need to get more guys on the moon and back. We need to do all sorts of things. And so we got to figure out what we need to do, and then we go spend the money, even if we deficit spend to get the money, just to get the economy going again. When they do that, that takes time. And when they do that, we're going to be spending money in a particular way at a particular place in a particular industry. And now politicians want to say, well, I think the government should spend the money on things that are going to benefit me, my state. I'm going to solve the unemployment problem in my state, not somebody else's state. And so now it's politics as to, well, what industry are we going to stimulate, and what geography is going to be affected, what political boundaries are going to be affected, and when is it going to happen? And so we got to come up with this idea, we got to put this idea through Congress, and then Congress has to vote on it, and after they vote on it, we turn it over to some bureaucratic agency to administer it, and then they've got to go out for bids, and they've got to find a contractor, contractor's got to find subcontractors, and then we got all this thing to do, and it takes time for this economic activity to work its way through the economy. In the meantime, something else could happen. For instance, I don't know, maybe foreigners all of a sudden want to buy a lot of American stuff, and the economy starts picking up on its own. At the very same time, we've got this big stimulus freight train coming down the pike here to help the economy going, and all of a sudden we get a double dose and we get twice as much stimulus as we really needed for the time. So number one would be the magnitude of the stimulus, and number two would be the timing of the stimulus. Both of those objections by Milton Friedman saying when the government gets involved in trying to manage the economy, they're just not very good at it. And they're not very good at it because they don't really have the tools. The government wasn't set up. It wasn't designed to control the economy. much less fine-tune the economy. It's just too big of a machine to do intricate sort of stuff. Analogy. I needed an analogy. We're doing some upholstering, and we're going to put some upholstery tacks into this chair here. And so what we get is we get a big sledgehammer. If that doesn't work, let's put a jackhammer to it. It's the wrong tool for the job. It's just the wrong tool for the job. It just makes as many problems or more problems than it creates. Now, a third objection that really isn't an economic objection, it's more of a political objection by Milton Friedman, is that it changes the culture of our nation. It changes the culture of and makes the nation more dependent on government and less free. Keynesian macroeconomic fiscal policy begins to change the very economy and the culture and the values of our country. For instance, in the little village that I grew up in, all the sidewalks were put down during the Depression era. And what is now an elementary school, then high school, was built during the Depression, and part of it was with government funds, and part of it was with government agencies, Progress Administration. And when that building was built, since the money came from the government to a large extent to build that public building, well, then the government has a duty to make sure that there's no fraud going on and make sure it's going to the purpose that the politicians wanted to. And in the industry that I worked in when I was working my way through college, which was the concrete industry, if we're pouring a driveway approach or a sidewalk or some sort of foundation or something, the concrete, ultimate strength of the concrete is dependent upon the water-cement ratio. And so if the concrete doesn't have enough water, it's really, really stiff and you can hardly get it into the place that you really want it. And so you add more water to it. But if you add more water to it, it dilutes it down, and now it's not going to be as strong concrete because there's more water per amount of cement in the concrete. But it makes it real easy to move around, and so it's easier to work with. So there's this combination there, and so there's always a tendency for workers, if they're pouring this sidewalk or something, they just pour the water to it, and then they don't have to even screed it off. They don't have to push around, stomp in it, and it'll just kind of seek its own level in there and get level, but it'll be pretty weak. It's not going to last very long. So what they do is they have this little column here, and I'm going a little bit of a tangent here, but I've got the little cylindrical thing, and you put the concrete in there, and it's like 1 foot high, and it's a cylinder, and once you take it in, you level it off, and then you lift the cylinder up, and then you put this little measuring thing, and you see how many inches it goes down. And it goes down, it's called slump. And so if it goes from here, water just runs all over the place. Well, that's a lot of slump. That's pretty watery. But if you pull the thing up and it doesn't go down at all, now that's stiff. Yeah, it's going to be really, really strong, but you're not going to be able to get it to go where you need it to go. So they're talking about normally a 3-inch slump or something like that. 3 to 4 inch slump gives you the plasticity you need. Now, who determines the quality of that concrete? Who determines the slump of the concrete that's going to go into that sidewalk that the government's building, or that putting in, or that school that the government's putting in? Who ultimately determines that? I know it's not just the architecture, but the architecture is going to have to work with the owner, and the owner gets what they want because they're paying the money. Now, in this case, who's the owner who's spending the money to put in that driveway, sidewalk, or building? Well, it's going to be the government. It's going to be the government. I'm dating myself here, but as a young person, I can remember going to restaurants, and you put your dime or quarter, I think it is, in the jute box, and the saying was, whoever puts their money into the jute box, that's the person that gets to call the tune that comes out. You might have seen jute boxes or something like that. If you put your quarter in, you're the guy who gets to pick which song is played. Why? Because it's your quarter. It's your quarter. Now, when the government buys this, it's the government's quarter, and so the government gets to determine the slump of the concrete and the design of it, and all these rules and regulations come with this government intervention in the economy to get the economy going again. Now, Milton Friedman stands back and looks at this and says, okay, we're in a Great Depression, so we're doing that, and so we have to give a little bit to get the economy going. But politicians said, hey, we came out of a Great Depression, and we were spending this money, and we spent all this money to go to war, and we spent a whole lot more money we took in, and you know, the world didn't come to an end, the sky didn't fall. So if we can spend more money than we take in to fight a war, why can't we spend more money than we take in to fight poverty, or fight illiteracy, or to be the first people on the moon, or whatever it is we need to do? I mean, nothing bad happens when you go into debt year after year after year after year. It's called sovereign debt. And under Keynesian philosophy, sovereign debt is different than consumer debt or individual private debt. So we can continue to deficit spend even when there isn't a catastrophe, even when there isn't an emergency. We're going to continue to spend to make sure that our economy's up here at full employment if we need that. And so Milton Friedman is looking at this and he said, well, wherever the money, the government's money goes, the government's rules and regulations and controls go as well. So if it's the government money, the government's going to determine what is going to be the wage rate for the laborer on that job. Well, if it's the government's money, the government gets to determine whether it's going to be a prevailing wage job or not. If you're going to work on this job, you got to go by these rules because the owner says so. And it's the owner's money. And they put quarter into the jukebox, and so they get to call the tune. If you want to work on this government job, you've got to live by these conditions. And as that went on, Milton Friedman stands back a little bit and said, boy, all these rules and regulations, and it's almost everywhere you turn, it seems like we're running into government money, and wherever there's government money, there's government and regulations and control, and pretty soon the government is involved and controlling just about everything in our life. And we, as a nation, we are losing our freedom because everything we touch has some government money attached to it, and government money attached to it has government rules and regulations that go with it. Some people that have been involved in, well, some of you know about student loans. And there's rules and regulations that come with those student rules because they come with federal money attached. You might be a person or know of a person who needs some sort of welfare. I know of individuals that are in that situation. Happy, glad that they're getting some assistance. But once they do that, then there's going to be some welfare worker that will have access to their home. And we'll look at their children. And we'll tell them whether they can homeschool or what kind of school they're going to have. And we'll dictate whether they have their vaccinations on time. And on and on and on, because wherever the government money goes, the government money has these rules and regulations that go with it. If you don't want the government to tell you what to do every minute of your life, well, then I guess you better not take its money, because once you take its money, then you come under its rules and regulations. And I would have to say that's the way things ought to be. If someone's paying you for something, well, then you should do it the way they say. But Milton Friedman is saying once we've gone this route here of trying to control the economy with fiscal policy and injecting money into the economy to spur the economy, then all of a sudden the politicians get involved in the act, and it's not just magnitude, and it's not just timing, but it's changing our value systems. It's changing the freedoms that we have in this country. So he had a television series in the 80s called Free to Choose, in which he was extolling the virtues of the free market and trying to convince Americans that we need to wean ourselves off of government rules and regulations that have come out of the Keynesian system. So where we're going now in this portion of the course, as we start into money and financial institutions, and we're into the monetary policy and monetarism, instead of having the federal government control the economy by controlling fiscal policy, Milton Friedman says, no, 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 please. Mr. Government, federal government, please get yourself out of the economy, just making things ultimately worse. Instead of having the government, the federal government, control the economy through fiscal policy, they should get out of it, and the economy should be controlled by the monetary authorities, meaning the Federal Reserve. And when we're talking about monetarism, the kind of policy we're talking about now is monetary policy, not fiscal policy anymore. Milton Friedman says, no, 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 fiscal policy really doesn't work. Well, when it does, you sometimes wish that it didn't. So rather than trying to control the economy through fiscal policy, we should control the economy through monetary. And we avoid the problem of these great big gobs of money coming into particular industries, and we avoid the timing problem, and we get rid of this problem where the government money's in everybody's life, and now the government's telling everybody what to do and how they can do it, because everybody is now getting involved in government money. So that's where we're going to pick up next time. We're going to pick up with money and financial institutions, monetary policy, and Milton Friedman, and how our money and banking system works.